All right, welcome to our public meeting addressing the changing shoreline at Lyons Prairie. My name is Gabe Powers, Conservation Ecology Manager with the district. The district has partnered with Hagen Associates to address issues associated with channel migration, erosion, submersion of the shoreline peninsula at Lyons Prairie and Marsh. And with us tonight is Dave Kraft with Hagen Associates, and he'll be going over the project, taking a look at some of the history, and having an opportunity for public input, and then also taking a look at some potential options to address the changing shoreline. With that, Mr. Kraft.
Thank you, Gabe. As Gabe mentioned, we're here today to talk about what has been the preliminary portion of the project, where we're looking at the shoreline along Lyons Prairie and Marsh. At this point, what we've done is data investigation and developed some concept solutions. What we're going to go over a little bit today is site history of the not just the Marsh area, but the whole river section as a whole. Some project goals of this meeting, and then some of our preliminary findings to inform any public input that we're looking to receive for the project. For the site history, it is a large portion of the site is an Illinois nature preserve, which is important because it connotates how critical some of the habitat on the site is, that it's valuable to protect, but that it's also good to understand what impacts may happen if additional work is done at the site as proposed. We're going to get into the dam history a little bit, meaning the downstream dam, and then a little bit of project history. Dam history, what we're talking about here is Algonquin Dam, so downstream of our project site along the Fox. Originally, it was built as a mill dam in 1854 and acquired by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources in 1939. The mill dam was removed in 1946, and the original Algonquin Dam was built in 1947. There were updates made to that to address some of the flooding and just modernization in 2002. What's relevant about some of these dates, which we'll get into, is how they've impacted how the system functions. And when we look back at what's happened along the river, in particular adjacent to Lyons Prairie and Marsh, how the dam may have impacted that. Here, looking at just a cross section of the updated dam from the 2002. What it shows, primarily here is the hinged gate that's been put in to manage flows a little bit better. This is, basically to create navigation in a upstream pool, for recreational use primarily, but also some commercial use. And the Fox Waterway Agency regulates the no wake in this area. One thing I'd like to point out is that at the crest, the dam is about 730 feet above sea level. Our shoreline elevations in the Lyons Prairie Marsh area are in the 732 to 733 range. So what that suggests is, in particular, in a flood condition, when there's water several feet potentially going over the dam does project back and have an impact on this site, which again will be relative as we get into some of our initial investigation findings. Project history. So, again, in the late 1990s, the Fox Waterway Agency had, started contact with the MCCD about this area. A specific letter was provided in 2003. This is all information that's been shared as part of past board meetings. Staff, in addition to ongoing meetings with Fox Waterway, had a specific meeting in 2011, board presentation in 2018, and then in 2021, there was a request to prepare an RFP to investigate this issue. This issue being where you can see on the image here, the recession of the shoreline over time. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more specifically as we move forward. But as you can see, the lines, the color graduated lines here show where the shoreline was in 1939, which is the oldest aerial photograph we have, predating the dam, obviously. 1954, 1988, 99, and 2017 are what is shown on here. In the images in the bottom there, you can see there's a substantial loss of shoreline as part of that evaluation that's been observed and noted. There's a variety of reasons for that we'll get into in just a second here. And then again, the contract we're working under was issued as a request for proposals by the district in late 2022. And again, Hay and Associates was selected in part because of our long-term relationship with the district and a lot of work on this section of the river to look at this issue. Project goals, really are sort of, fourfold a little bit. Site assessment, we want to look at what may be happening, what are the mechanisms behind it, what forces may be causing, some of this loss of shoreline. Public outreach and engagement, that's tonight. That's the online collection, the online collection application that's set up, and whatever and other opportunities to provide input. Alternative and cost development, we've begun a preliminary set of that. We've got some ideas on what it may look like to do some repairs here. This public input period will further inform that, and then ultimately developing a report and recommendations. I've included a riverine cross section here that Gabe had originally included in presentations to the board. What this sort of shows is what a healthy river cross section would look like in a natural setting. The thing to point out is very little of the Fox River looks like this anymore. It's seawalls, it's homes, it's businesses right up to the edge. The floodplain's largely been taken up by development. This section of Lyons Prairie and Marsh is one of the few sections actually that does have remnant features like we see here, with wetland floodplains and the ability to have dynamic interaction with different habitats along the river floodplain. Meeting goals, that's this meeting we're talking about. Again, go over that preliminary assessment and alternatives, seek additional public input. There's a variety of ways to do that. And then some just project discussion. We'll be here both online and in person after this presentation for, till at least 7 in person. And I think the plan is at least 6 online. And then what we're looking for is any information people want to provide on the reach that may be relevant to this issue and the use of the river in this, use of this portion of the river. I've screen grabbed here. This is the MCCD website that shows the page for this website. This has on it a couple of relevant pieces of information beyond the announcement for this meeting. There's a website with a web map where you can provide information on a spatial basis, meaning you can drop a pin on the map and write in and upload pictures on anything you want to provide. Additionally, we've set up a project-specific email to collect information. We do in person here have some paper forms too, if anyone would like to fill out a paper form to provide input. So any way you'd like to provide it, we're happy to take any input on the project. So getting into preliminary findings, what we'll kind of walk through here is site assessment, preliminary alternatives, and then costs, which are quite literally in this case, the $1 million questions. This is all preliminary. Again, this is to give us an idea of where we may be headed, to be further informed by any public input we may receive. As we get into site assessment, Kirsten and I spent quite a bit of time out there in a canoe last fall, really getting a feel for this. District staff has been out there a lot, so we've really developed a good understanding of the site and what's going on out there. To convey that, we've put together an exhibit here. There is a paper copy if you want to take a closer look in person here. But this is some of the information, sort of distilled down as far as data collection. In addition to that field reconnaissance that we've performed out there and collected some limited survey information and really observed the entirety of the shoreline in this reach, we've done a pretty extensive review of historic aerial photographs. As the district had early on, we've looked at all available aerial photographs to just kind of get a feel for things. With that, one of the things I'd like to point out is we've also, to the best extent we're able, looked at what the date of those photographs are, both by year, but also by month. Again, many of the newer ones in particular, we can get monthly, or what month that information was provided. We've back correlated that to gauge records from USGS gauges along the Fox, because one thing we want to look at is if we're assessing what may look like 100 feet of recession, is that the case that it was a flooded condition and that part of that is it's just submerged from flooding? Or has there really been that measured erosion that's taken place on the shoreline? In this image, I think we want to point out that the 1939 aerial is, we believe to be from the July-August time period. So that's going to be one of our driest periods of the year. generally showing the most exposed shoreline. So when we do that evaluation showing up to 200 feet of loss in a comparative aerial, we have to take into account that we're comparing it to a period of very dry, that's likely the driest on record for that year. The other thing to point out is this is pre-dam. The 1939 aerial, where you're comparing those biggest losses from before the Algonquin Dam was placed, which we've shown by elevation in the previous slide, is impacting this area. So one thing we want to kind of look at is some of these areas, in particular in the west of the peninsula, in the internal of the site. Those aren't as expansive in this 1939 aerial. That's likely based upon that there is no influence from the dam during this period of time. And so you've got different vegetative communities, certainly less prone to have been impacted by some of the very aggressive invasive species that we have now. Reed canary grass, cattail, Phragmites, all of which are present on the site, that tend to also change how things look. The other thing, we get to the 1993 just as a further example of how the data of these aerials and how we need to really factor in what we're looking at. This is during, what was one of the more historic floods, in the history of the Fox in 1993. So you can see in this case, you've basically almost got a connection from the upstream area up towards Rawson Bridge Road down through the marsh. Again, relevant in that we have to make sure if we're going to assess recession of the shoreline, we have to take things like that into account. As we get into the other side of the images here, one thing we wanted to point out from our field reconnaissance is that oftentimes what we see in a situation of aggressive erosion is you'll see banks, exposed banks that are multiple feet in height that are showing substantial sediment wasting on an observable basis. Really, from top to bottom on this reach, we don't see that. We see relatively short banks that are relatively well vegetated. Certainly, a river is a natural system. There is going to be some sediment movement. But for the most part, there weren't observable areas of substantial aggressive existing erosion. Again, going both ways on that, we have been in 2 periods of drought here over the last couple of summers. So we certainly do factor in that those drought periods may have allowed for some of that vegetation to recolonize over that drought period we've experienced. All part of the story that we're looking at. Big picture, we've looked at this, on aerials, and then the district has done a bunch of drone flying to kind of get an idea of what's going on in the bigger reach. There's a lot that will and has been considered. For instance, as an example, the adjacent bank has largely been armored with stone riprap. That causes a wide variety of issues. It does prevent the river from moving both directions, which means really any erosion is only happening on the unarmored bank. It can also reflect wake activity. So if you've got wake activity in here, in addition to the direct impacts of this western bank, you can see that reflection and almost get a double whammy off of that stone treatment. Again, rivers are dynamic systems. What we see in these images is, probably an old meander from the river that may be thousands of years old is this internal piece here. That's what this river wants to do on a geologic time frame, meaning multiple thousands of years. When we lock it in place, we prevent it from doing that, and that can create some of these instability and erosion issues that have to be factored in when we consider different alternatives. I think the other thing we'd just like to point out, with this aerial here as we go through just some of the assessment things that have been done, is like we go back to that wetland, kind of floodplain cross section. This is a very naturally functioning area. I mean, you've got different depths. The sediment is moving its way through this system. You've got a lot of different habitat features within here with those depths, with different vegetative communities. You've got the outer areas. You've got a lot of large woody debris stacked up in here. I know even when we looked at this RFP, it was about this time of year last year, and there was over a dozen mating softshell turtles back in this back bay, which again suggests that this is a very well used and valuable piece of habitat here. There's 2 ways to look at that, which we will look at both as we move forward. One is we want to protect it, obviously, right? That's part of it. But 2, we want to do that in a way that's not going to impact what's already happening in a natural setting. And so those are the things that get factored in. We've not done any specific hydraulic modeling or wake assessment yet. That's the next phase of the project, pending public input to provide that final bit of background information to inform recommendations. But next, I'll get into some of the recommendations that have come out of this initial assessment. So again, the guidance that we were given, is to look at what's happened, do some of the assessment we've just talked about is as far as, what level of recession, meaning bank erosion, may have occurred. And then what are the mechanisms by which you might recapture that bank? And then ultimately, at this point, it's been largely subjective, and we'll get to some of that modeling as the next step. What are the benefits or potential detriments of pursuing a project like this? So again, generally what we're using here is these aerial photographs, these historic aerial photographs where we're mapping out the bank lines, and then we're looking at how much area has been lost. In doing that, we've considered a variety of things: what the date of the photograph is, what gauge records may show of the water levels at that time. And we're arriving at least preliminary recommendations at opportunities to potentially recover shoreline. And we'll get into a couple cross sections and some costs on what that may look like. As a starting point, what we've really sort of done is just looked at a suite of different years, pre-dam, post-dam, and sort of in between, the modern condition and the immediate post-dam condition, what it would look like to, again, recover land, essentially, in this case, which is going to require armoring and other things. Ultimately, because of that assessment related to the impact of the dam construction in 1946 on elevations, where we landed was there does not appear to have been substantial loss in the internal marsh area. So we fairly early on, we concluded we really weren't looking to recapture any lost land in the marsh area. Again, going back to the fact, the other thing we believe is that's a fairly well-functioning, healthy habitat. And I think just very generally, probably more harm than good if you got into doing work in there. So options now at this point, which again are really just preliminary options to start to get a range of potential costs and ideas. What would it look like to recover, give or take, the 1939 shoreline, the 1974 shoreline? The relevance of picking 1974 isn't necessarily that we just have a map from that date. It's that the effective FEMA hydraulic model for the Fox River was adopted, I think, in either 73 or 74. So the floodplain that's been defined for the Fox River really goes back to that date. It'll probably get updated sooner rather than later here. But that allows us to say, if we were going to look at what ultimately will be fills within the river and floodplain, there is support for using that date, because in theory, the floodplain elevations that everyone is designing to are based upon what they would have seen in the river at that time. That's the relevance of looking at that date. It's not just random. The 1974 is not just random. In selecting kind of the next options here, we did do sort of a look at all the aerials from then till now. And post 2014, there seems to be a little more aggressive loss of things. So that's where we kind of went back to that 2014 date. And pretty much from 2008, through 2010-ish on, we've got aerials just about every year. Again, generally speaking, we were seeing that the rate of recession, the rate of erosion picked up a little bit then. That's still stuff that probably is going to take a little more modeling and analysis to really get to on an effective level why that may be. I think very preliminarily and subjectively, that's consistent with some of the big, larger storms we've been seeing on a more frequent basis, that's supported by some of the statistical information we have from rainfall records and stuff that the ISWS, or Illinois State Water Survey, and University of Illinois have been doing. We really, truly, genuinely, everyone hears it on the news, another 100-year storm. We have actually been getting more bigger storms lately. That's supported by the gauge record. So we look at these options, and what we've done is sort of quantify, okay, how much area is there? The idea being to backfill that with material, likely dredged material from the river system. And then ultimately we would need to protect those banks. That's where option 4 and 5 come in. there are opportunities to just say, instead of trying to recover land that's been lost, we could just protect what's there now. We could either do that pretty much from the start to the finish of the preserve, which is option 4, or pick some of the areas that have shown long-term more aggressive erosion and be more selective with that protection. Again, protection in this case almost assuredly being some level of stone treatment like you see across the river, like you see up and down the river. Again, just sort of some preliminary looks at some of that, some of those kinds of things. Again, very simple cross sections at this point we've developed. This helps us just quantify things, but looking at placing something to stabilize at the toe, it would likely be some degree of stone, and then whether you could backfill just with dredged material or imported material, or again, like they've done on the islands on the chain, you could put a bag behind there and pump into that. That certainly would be an option in this case too. Our costs sort of factor both of those things in, preliminary costs at least, but that's the general idea. Yeah.
Just the question from the uninitiated. When you use the word toe, what do you
Yeah. Oh, great question. Sorry. Yes. So toe would basically be the bottom of the slope. Kind of underwater where the slope, comes down the bank, the river bank, where that comes down and ties into sort of a flatter riverbed. We would call that the toe of the slope. It's important to protect that because that's going to be the area that's generally going to have some of the strongest forces. And if we want to hold any material we're going to recover up in there, we need to provide some stability to hold that in place. Again, these are very generalized cross sections and will be developed as we finalize the plan. But the idea is creating something that would allow you to retain additional material. I think as we get into the cost, it'll become apparent that this is not a cheap and easy project, and I'll flip to those next. But the things to consider here is going back to the idea that most of this site is a nature preserve. We can't just run a bunch of trucks through here to recover this. This is all going to have to either likely come from pumping from the river directly or being barged in to replace materials. That includes the stone. That makes the cost exponentially higher than if we were just putting it along a road somewhere. So that's factored into here. The final assessment, as we develop all the public input and reach some final conclusions, we're also going to look at what are the benefits of recovering this land. Right now, just candidly, most of what we're talking about, even on that bank edge, is relatively impacted, with invasive species, things coming up and down the river. It's going to be hard to manage that. It's not the heart of the nature preserve right along the shoreline there. And so, even if in the widest sections there where there may be over 100 feet that could be recovered, what that would be is a little bit dubious. It's likely to be hard to manage new land that is going to likely get inundated with invasive species fairly quickly, just based on where it's at, and then be harder to access. We're not going to be creating more nature preserve, I guess, is the simplest way to put it. Couple other things just to point out before we get into the costs. We've kind of assembled a little bit of a preliminary assessment of what the permitting might look like for this. Candidly, that's going to be a very uphill thing to look at too. There are limitations as to how much shoreline can be restored under particular permits from both the Corps and the IDNR. And so we are in excess of those, which means we would either need what are called individual permits, which becomes a long kind of protracted permitting process, or we may need to do things in phases if it were to be pursued. The other thing, and this gets back to the relevance of that 1974 aerial photograph on where our floodplain maps are based off of, all of this, even though it is potentially eroded material, does constitute fill within the floodplain. And so we'll have to confirm that this won't have any impacts upstream or downstream. It will. Again, rivers are dynamic systems. Whatever we do here is going to have impacts within the whole reach of the river. That doesn't necessarily mean they're entirely detrimental impacts, but it changes anything we do to change here, which is part of why this has happened in the first place, is all of the changes that have happened on the river. Any changes to the river are going to change how it may function. When we look at restoration, what we try to do is do that in a way that pushes it in a good direction, both from a limiting flooding and erosion, from an anthropomorphic perspective, but also what can we do to restore more natural function where we've got a site like this that's got the opportunity to do that. So we can get real into the weeds on that stuff, which really isn't the intent of tonight. That'll be the final report. But here we go with budget. Again, these are very preliminary numbers just based on picking some lines on the plans. If we were to stabilize and backfill to that 1939 perimeter, what we're estimating is over $9 million to do that. Similarly, as you go down, obviously, the less you're recovering, the less imported material, the smaller the project. That 74 number, we're about $7.5 million. 2014, $3.25 million. And then, even to armor the banks, you're over $3 million or $2 million, depending upon which option. Takeaway is here, these are very preliminary numbers, very subject to change. Quite honestly, these look at things as one big project. If you broke it out into a series of phased projects, it's just going to go up from there because you're going to be paying for mobilization over and over again. Main takeaway is it's a high cost effort to entertain these kinds of solutions. So where do we go from here? Again, right now we're in the public input solicitation phase. That's tonight, and then again, those online input applications we've got set up are going to be on and available through May 18th. Then what we'll do is finalize this assessment and analysis, determine what level of additional modeling we want to complete to finalize the report, develop final alternatives and costs, getting into refining some of the things related to, again, sediment collection units and things like that, and then prepare and final report with the idea being this is aimed primarily at providing the science behind, how would you do it and what would the benefits and constraints be of doing it, not necessarily aimed from a technical study perspective at drawing large-scale conclusions of should you do it, but giving the framework of what would be considered if a project was pursued. And with that, are there any questions?
All right, thanks, Dave. We're gonna stop the online portion here.